February 1966, RCA, Studio B, Nashville, 2:30 in the morning. The session musicians are exhausted, ready to go home. Then Elvis sits down at the piano and starts singing How Great Thou Art. Nobody leaves for the next 6 hours, where it all began. If you grew up in the South in the 1930s and 40s, you knew church music. Not the polite hymns from the hymnals. The real thing, the Pentecostal fire, the hand clapping, the voices that shook the walls and made you believe heaven was listening. That was young Elvis Presley's first music education. The Assembly of God Church in Tupelo, Mississippi. His mama Gladys would take him every Sunday, and sometimes Wednesday nights too. They'd sit in those hard wooden pews, and when the congregation started singing, something happened to that little boy. He didn't just hear the music. He felt it in his bones, in his soul. Pause ones. Gospel music wasn't about performance. It was about surrender, about opening yourself up and letting something bigger pour through you. The singers didn't worry about hitting perfect notes. They worried about hitting truth. Elvis absorbed all of it, the way voices would blend and clash and soar together, the way a song could build and build until the whole room was shaking, the way music could make you feel like you were touching something holy. Years later, when Elvis became famous for hip-shaking rock and roll, when parents were calling his music the devil's work, Elvis would say quietly to friends, "Gospel is the only music I really care about. Everything else is just how I make a living." He meant it. The secret sessions. Throughout Elvis's career, people who worked with him noticed a pattern. After long days recording commercial material, movie soundtracks, pop singles, whatever RCA or Colonel Parker wanted, Elvis would get restless. He'd look at the clock, see it was getting late, see the musicians packing up their instruments, and he'd say, "Hey, anybody want to stick around for a while? Sing some gospel?" Then, something shifts in the room that nobody expected. The first few times, musicians thought he was joking. It was midnight, 1 in the morning. They'd been working for 12 hours. They had families waiting, beds calling. But something in Elvis's voice made them stay. And once they started singing gospel with Elvis, they understood. This wasn't work. This was church. Charlie Hodge, Elvis's longtime friend and backup singer, remembered these sessions vividly. Elvis would sit at the piano, and we'd start with something simple, maybe Peace in the Valley or I Believe, and then it would just flow, song after song, nobody watching the clock, nobody worried about mistakes, just pure music. The studio would transform. The harsh overhead lights seemed softer. The cold professionalism melted away. Guys who'd been session musicians for decades, men who'd played with everyone from Hank Williams to Roy Orbison, would find themselves getting emotional. It was like being transported, one pianist later said, like we weren't in a studio in Nashville anymore. We were in some little church in Mississippi, singing because we couldn't help it. The February 1966 night. February 1966 was a particularly intense recording period for Elvis. He was working on the soundtrack for a forgettable movie and some singles for RCA. The sessions had been long and frustrating. The material wasn't inspiring. Elvis was going through the motions. By late evening on February 25th, they'd finished what they needed to finish. It was after midnight. The engineers started shutting down equipment. Musicians began packing up. Elvis sat at the piano, not moving, just staring at the keys. Felton Jarvis, the producer, walked over. "Elvis, we're done for tonight. Good work." Elvis nodded but didn't get up. After a moment, he started playing softly, the opening chords to How Great Thou Art. The room went quiet. Musicians who were halfway out the door stopped. Elvis started singing. Not the polished professional Elvis, the raw Elvis, the church Elvis. Eyes closed, pouring everything into the words. "O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the worlds thy hands have made." What happens next moves even the toughest musicians to tears. If you grew up singing in church, or if you remember when gospel music was the soundtrack of Sunday mornings, share your memories in the comments. And if you're discovering this side of Elvis for the first time, hit subscribe. His relationship with gospel music tells you everything you need to know about who he really was. The floodgates open. One by one, the musicians set down their instrument cases and came back. The backup singers, who'd been heading to their cars, returned. Nobody said anything. They just found their places and joined in. What followed was 6 hours of pure gospel music. No contracts, no pay, no recordings being made, at first. Just a group of people singing because something bigger than professionalism was pulling them. They sang "Stand By Me." They sang "Where No One Stands Alone." They sang "Known Only to Him." Elvis led most of them, but sometimes he'd stop and let the others take over, adding harmonies, building walls of sound that seemed to lift the roof. Pause ones. Gordon Stoker of the Jordanaires, who sang backup on countless Elvis recordings, later said, "I sang with Elvis for 20 years. I was there for the rock hits, the ballads, all of it. But nothing, and I mean nothing, compared to those late-night gospel sessions. That's where you saw his soul." Around 3 a.m., Felton Jarvis made a decision. He quietly started recording. These weren't scheduled recordings. RCA hadn't approved them. But Felton knew he was witnessing something special, something that needed to be captured. Elvis didn't notice. Or if he did, he didn't care. He was somewhere else entirely. The backup singers, the Jordanaires and the Imperials Quartet, created complex harmonies on the fly. No arrangements, no sheet music, just ears and hearts and years of experience. The blend was perfect, effortless. How Great Thou Art. By sunrise, they've recorded something that will change Elvis's life. When they came back to How Great Thou Art around 5 a.m., something transcendent happened. Elvis had sung it earlier that night, but this time was different. This time, everyone was fully locked in, fully present. Elvis started the first verse alone. His voice, that incredible instrument that could do anything, was tender, almost fragile. Then the Jordanaires came in with harmonies that made the hair on your arms stand up. By the second verse, Elvis's voice grew stronger. By the chorus, he was soaring, hitting notes that shouldn't have been possible at 5 in the morning after 6 hours of singing. "Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee, how great thou art, how great thou art." The room was electric. You could feel it, something sacred happening in that moment, not religious in a churchy way, sacred in the way truth is sacred, in the way pure expression is sacred. When Elvis finished, there was complete silence. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Then someone, witnesses disagree on who, started crying, and then others. Tough studio musicians, guys who prided themselves on professionalism, wiping tears from their faces. Elvis sat at the piano, head down, breathing hard. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet too. "That's the one," he said quietly. "That's the one we keep." The aftermath. The sun was coming up when the session finally ended. Musicians stumbled out into the Nashville dawn, exhausted but somehow energized. Several later said they went home and couldn't sleep. They were too full of whatever had happened in that room. Felton Jarvis took the recordings to RCA executives. They were skeptical. Gospel albums didn't sell like rock and roll. Gospel didn't make Elvis money, but Elvis insisted. He wanted How Great Thou Art released, wanted a full gospel album. RCA relented. The album How Great Thou Art was released in early 1967. Critics loved it. But more importantly, it won Elvis his first Grammy Award. Not for rock and roll, not for pop, but for gospel music. When Elvis accepted the Grammy, he was more emotional than anyone had ever seen him at an award show. "This means more to me than anything," he said. "This is the music I grew up with. This is the music I love." Throughout the rest of his career, Elvis would return to gospel music again and again. In 1972, he won another Grammy for the gospel album He Touched Me. In his live shows, especially in the 1970s, he'd include extended gospel medleys. Those were always the moments when his voice sounded purest, most alive. And, decades later, those who were there still call it the most spiritual night of their careers. Why it mattered. You could perform Elvis's entire catalog, all the hip-shaking hits, all the romantic ballads, all the rock and roll classics, and still not understand him. To understand Elvis Presley, you had to hear him sing gospel, because that's where he went to remember who he was. Not Elvis the star, not Elvis the product, just Elvis. The boy from Tupelo who sang in church because it made him feel close to God and close to his mama and close to something real. Pause ones. The commercial recordings paid the bills. Gospel music fed his soul. Those late-night sessions, unscheduled, unpaid, unplanned, were where Elvis recharged, where the pressure of being Elvis Presley melted away, and he could just be a voice in a choir, singing hymns that had been sung for 100 years and would be sung for 100 more. The musicians who experienced those sessions never forgot them. They'd go on to play with other famous artists, other legends, but they'd always say the same thing. Nothing was quite like those nights with Elvis and gospel music. Because those nights weren't about fame or money or charts. They were about the thing that made Elvis pick up a guitar in the first place, the pure joy of making music that moves the soul. And in those moments, in those late-night gospel sessions, Elvis Presley wasn't the king of rock and roll. He was something better. He was a man singing to save himself. If you only know Elvis from Hound Dog and Jailhouse Rock, you're missing the most important part of his story. Gospel music was his foundation, his refuge, his truth. Share this with anyone who thinks they know Elvis but has never heard him sing, "How Great Thou Art." Let them discover the side of him that mattered most. Subscribe for more untold Elvis stories that reveal the human being behind the icon. Because the more layers you peel back, the more beautiful and complicated and real he becomes. And if you've ever turned to music when nothing else could help, if you've ever sung or played or listened your way through darkness, you understand exactly why Elvis needed those gospel nights. Thank you for watching, and may you find your own place where your soul can sing.